In 2004, a young father took his 1-year-old son out for a quiet day of fishing on a Montana lake, and neither returned now, 15 years later. A brutal drought exposes their long-lost boat buried in the muddy lakebed, and inside, investigators uncover a baby's car seat and blanket that unravel a haunting mystery of what really happened on the water that day. The morning of July 18, 2004, began like countless others in the quiet town of Stillwater, Montana. The sun rose warm and clear, the kind of summer light that shimmered on the lake and promised a perfect day outdoors. At the edge of the Branson home, Luke Branson loaded up his small aluminum fishing boat with gear, humming softly to himself as he worked. At just 28, he had the lean frame of someone used to long days of labor and the easy smile of a man who adored being a father. Balanced on his hip was 1-year-old Caleb, dressed in yellow overalls and gripping his father's shirt with chubby fists. Neighbors later recalled seeing Luke wave cheerfully as he secured the boat to his truck and drove toward the lake. It was Caleb's first real outing with him, a small adventure Luke had promised his wife, Rachel, would be safe. She had hesitated that morning, watching him buckle their son's car seat into the boat before departure, but Luke reassured her with the easy confidence she had always trusted. He promised to be back by dinner with stories and perhaps a few trout for the pan. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up and the lake darkened under heavy clouds. Rachel grew restless, stepping onto the porch every few minutes to scan the road for the familiar shape of Luke's truck. When the sun began to sink behind the ridge and the driveway remained empty, dread gnawed at her. By nightfall, the phone call went out, first to friends, then to authorities. Within hours, search crews were combing the water, flashlights bouncing across the restless surface. For days, helicopters circled overhead while divers scoured the depths, pulling up weeds and twisted branches, but no sign of the boat or its passengers. The community rallied, but each effort ended the same way, with more questions than answers. Whispers started almost immediately: had Luke's boat capsized, or had something darker happened on that lake? For Rachel, none of it mattered. What mattered was that her husband and her baby were gone, swallowed by water that refused to give them back. It would be 15 years before Stillwater Lake stirred again, when an unrelenting drought pulled the waterline so low that the past, long hidden beneath its surface, finally began to rise. The first days after Luke and Caleb vanished felt endless, each one dragging into the next, with no answers in sight. The sheriff's department set up a command post near the boat launch, a tent with maps pinned to plywood and radios squawking updates that rarely brought good news. Volunteers lined the shoreline with binoculars while boats zigzagged across the water, their motors churning against the lake's steady silence. Divers went down again and again, emerging cold and empty-handed. The search dogs grew restless, picking up scents that dissipated over the water, leaving the handlers frustrated and weary. Rachel hovered at the water's edge through it all, refusing to leave even when friends begged her to rest. She clutched Caleb's spare blanket, its faded yellow fabric pressed to her face, as if willing it to lead her to her son. Each time a diver surfaced or a search boat returned, her breath caught, hoping this time they would bring word. But each time, the answer was the same: nothing. No life jackets, no fishing rods, not even a scrap of clothing. It was as if the lake had swallowed the boat whole. Rumors began to spread. Some whispered Luke might have staged his disappearance, that the pressures of providing for a young family had pushed him to run. Others claimed the boat must have flipped in a storm and the bodies had sunk beyond reach. A few even suggested something sinister, pointing out how odd it was that nothing at all had been recovered. For Rachel, those whispers were knives. She knew Luke. She knew he would never abandon her, never take their baby into danger willingly. The lake was the only explanation she could bear, but even that felt like a cruel betrayal. After 2 weeks, the official search was scaled back. The command post packed up, volunteers went home, and the Branson property grew quiet except for the steady stream of casseroles and hushed condolences delivered to her door. Rachel could only stare at the empty crib in the corner of her bedroom and the silence that filled the house where Caleb's laughter should have been. The mystery of the vanished boat became part of Stillwater's folklore, a story people retold with lowered voices. For Rachel, it was not folklore. It was a wound that never closed, a question that haunted every passing day. The years that followed drifted by in a blur for Rachel, each one marked not by birthdays or milestones, but by anniversaries of absence. Every July, she would drive to Stillwater Lake, stand on the worn dock where Luke had last waved, and stare at the water as though sheer will might coax it into giving her family back. Neighbors grew cautious in their sympathy, unsure what words could possibly mend what had been broken. Some avoided the subject altogether, while others offered theories that Rachel shut out the moment they began. For her, speculation was salt in a wound that never healed. She kept Luke's tackle box on a shelf in the garage, untouched, its lures neatly organized, just as he had left them. Caleb's baby clothes remained folded in a drawer, their bright colors a painful reminder of how short his time had been. At night, Rachel often found herself holding the small yellow blanket that had once smelled of baby powder and milk, now faint with dust and memory. It was the only piece of her son that felt real, tangible proof that he had existed in her arms before vanishing into the shadows of that lake. Life in Stillwater moved on around her. New families moved into town, children grew, businesses changed hands. The story of Luke and Caleb became something whispered to outsiders, a cautionary tale told on fishing docks when the water was still and the night was quiet. "That lake doesn't give back what it takes," the older locals would say, shaking their heads with the certainty of those who had seen too much. Rachel never remarried. She found work at the library, spending her days among books where silence felt less suffocating. She smiled when expected, attended town events, and appeared to carry on, but the absence sat with her always, a presence she could neither see nor escape. Even as hope faded, she clung to the smallest fragment of belief that one day, somehow, an answer would come. 15 years later, in the summer of 2019, when Montana faced one of its worst droughts in decades, the lake that had consumed her family began to shrink. Its waters pulled back, bearing stretches of shoreline unseen in living memory, and with that slow retreat, Stillwater Lake prepared to give up its secret at last. The summer of 2019 brought a relentless heat to Montana, the kind that cracked the earth and turned rivers into thin trickles. Stillwater Lake, once deep and steady, shrank with every passing week. Locals who had fished its waters for decades remarked that they had never seen the shoreline so far from its usual edge. Boat ramps ended in mud, docks stood on dry ground, and the water that remained grew murky, its secrets closer to the surface than ever before. On an August morning, two brothers launched their small boat from what was left of the ramp, hoping to make the most of the dwindling season. They steered toward a cove, long hidden by high water, the air heavy with the smell of sun-baked weeds. As they drifted along the shallows, something caught their eyes. A curved shape jutted from the mud, its metallic sheen dulled by years beneath the surface. At first they thought it was scrap metal, another relic the lake had swallowed, but as they drew closer, the outline of a hull became clear. The brothers waded into the muck, their boots sinking deep, until the object revealed itself fully. A small aluminum fishing boat lay half buried in the mud, its paint flaked away, its edges jagged with corrosion. The registration numbers, though worn, were still faintly legible. One of the men read them aloud and fell silent. Both knew the numbers by memory. They matched the boat that had belonged to Luke Branson. Word traveled quickly, spreading through Stillwater like a storm. Sheriff's deputies cordoned off the area, reporters appeared with cameras, and neighbors gathered on the banks in hushed disbelief. Rachel stood among them, her heart pounding in her chest. She had prepared herself for this moment for 15 years, yet seeing the boat with her own eyes broke something inside her. Deputies worked carefully, shoveling away the layers of mud that clung to the hull. Every scrape of metal against dirt felt like peeling back time itself. When at last the boat tilted free of the earth and the deputies peered inside. Silence fell over the crowd. The seats were still bolted in place, rusted but intact, and in the stern, a small car seat sat strapped down, its fabric stiffened and bleached, pale by years in the dark. Draped across it was a fragment of yellow cloth, once soft, now tattered with age. The discovery of the boat turned Stillwater into a place suspended between past and present. Deputies worked under the glare of the summer sun, hauling the aluminum vessel onto a flatbed truck, the mud sucking at its underside as though reluctant to let it go. The onlookers watched in silence, many with arms folded, others with hands clasped tightly at their waists, as though they were standing at a graveside. Rachel stood apart from the crowd, her face pale and unreadable. Her eyes never left the yellow scrap of cloth that clung to the car seat inside the wreck. At the sheriff's department garage, the boat was placed beneath bright fluorescent lights, its details revealed more starkly than in the muddy cove. Investigators documented every angle, their cameras flashing over the peeling paint, the warped edges of the hull, the rusted bolts that still held the car seat in place. They lifted out the faded blanket and sealed it in plastic, its color dull but unmistakably yellow. Rachel recognized it instantly. It was the blanket Caleb had clutched when he left that morning in Luke's arms. She had packed it herself, tucking it around him to keep the cool lake breeze from making him fuss. Seeing it again after 15 years made her knees weaken. The boat itself showed damage, but not in the way investigators expected. The hull bore long scrapes, as though it had been dragged along rock, but there were no punctures, no signs of a violent collision. It looked less like a vessel that had sunk mid-lake, and more like one that had been abandoned and swallowed gradually by the water. That detail unsettled everyone who studied it. If the boat had not capsized or shattered, then what had happened to Luke and Caleb? Reporters pressed for answers, their cameras waiting for sound bites from officials who had none to give. Sheriff Harlan, who had been young and newly appointed during the original search, spoke carefully. "We are treating this as both a recovery and an investigation. The boat is intact, but the circumstances are not clear. We will continue searching the area for additional evidence." Rachel left the garage quietly, her eyes fixed on the ground. For years she had begged the lake for a sign, for anything at all. Now that the boat was here, she realized it carried not closure, but the heavy weight of even darker questions. The following days brought a steady procession of experts into Stillwater, each called in to study the boat that had finally surfaced after so many years. The sheriff's department garage, normally used for impounded vehicles and minor evidence, now felt more like a shrine. Crime scene tape sectioned off the perimeter, and only those with clearance could step inside. Rachel was given special permission. She moved carefully among the investigators, her eyes tracing the outline of the boat she had seen Luke tow away that morning in 2004. It was smaller than she remembered, shrunken by time and the indignities of mud and water. Forensic teams photographed the car seat from every angle before carefully unbolting it from the stern. The straps had stiffened and cracked, but they remained buckled, as though Caleb had been secured tightly for the ride. The sight made Rachel's chest ache. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing the plastic evidence bag that held the blanket. The texture she had known so well was gone, replaced by a brittle weight, yet it still carried the ghost of her son's presence. An inspector pointed out the long scratches along the hull to Sheriff Harlan. "Not typical impact marks," he explained. "These look like abrasions from being dragged or grounded. There's no hole, no evidence the boat filled with water suddenly." That observation traveled quickly among the team, deepening the mystery. If the vessel had not capsized or broken apart, then where had Luke and Caleb gone? Divers were sent back to the shrinking lake, this time with a more precise grid around the cove where the boat was found. They combed through the thick mud and tangled weeds, lifting out debris and fragments of wood. Some pieces belonged to the boat itself, but others were unidentifiable, too weathered to tell. Still, no human remains were recovered. News outlets ran headlines that reignited old speculation. Theories once buried came roaring back. Had Luke walked away from the boat, leaving it to sink? Had someone else been with him that day? For Rachel, every question was a reopening of an old wound. She had begged for answers, and now that the boat had been unearthed, it seemed only to multiply the unknowns. The lake had given her something, but not the one thing she needed most. The drought had turned Stillwater Lake into a landscape that felt foreign even to those who had lived beside it all their lives. Shorelines stretched farther than anyone remembered, revealing sandbars and patches of mud where families once swam and fished. Locals walked the exposed ground with curiosity, picking up rusted lures, bent cans, and pieces of driftwood, each fragment a reminder of summers past. But in the wake of the boat's discovery, every step also carried the possibility of uncovering something darker. Sheriff Harlan ordered daily sweeps of the area where the Branson vessel had been found. Deputies waded through knee-deep muck, probing the floor with poles, while divers scoured the deepest remaining channels. The heat was oppressive, the air thick with the smell of algae and decay. Some days yielded nothing. Other times, investigators pulled out scraps of metal or wood that had to be cataloged before being dismissed as unrelated debris. Rachel returned to the site often, standing on the drying bank with the waterline far below her. To others, the place looked bleak, but for her it was sacred ground. She remembered Luke's excitement that morning, how he had strapped Caleb's car seat into the boat like it was a throne. "First fishing trip," he had told her with a grin. Now, as she stared at the cracked mud where the vessel had rested unseen for so long, she tried to imagine how that day had truly ended. Reporters continued circling, their questions sharp, their lenses trained on every movement near the lake. For many of them, this was more than a local mystery. It was a human story that had refused to fade, one that had haunted the region for a decade and a half. They pressed Rachel for interviews, but she said little. She let the image of the boat, the car seat, and the tattered blanket speak for themselves. Speculation grew with each passing day. Some believed the drought would eventually reveal Luke and Caleb's remains, tangled in the lakebed weeds. Others argued that the absence meant something more sinister, that perhaps the lake was never the true grave. As the sun set over the drained shoreline, casting long shadows across the cracked earth, Rachel felt the same thought rising in her chest. The boat had come back, but her family had not. The question that haunted her most was why. Under the harsh white lights of the sheriff's garage, the Branson boat revealed its secrets reluctantly. Investigators in gloves moved with quiet precision, photographing every inch before brushing away layers of dried silt that clung stubbornly to the metal. The air smelled of damp mud and rust, and the stillness in the room carried the weight of reverence, as though they were handling the relic of a tragedy that had long defined Stillwater. The baby's car seat sat in the corner of the boat, its straps cracked and stiff. Technicians leaned close, noting how it remained buckled, suggesting Luke had secured Caleb before the boat ever left shore. The faded blanket, now sealed in a plastic bag, was sent to the state lab for DNA analysis, though Rachel had already confirmed its identity. She remembered packing it herself, folding it neatly before placing it on the seat that morning. It was a memory so sharp it cut through the fog of 15 years in an instant. Attention turned next to the hull. Along its underside were deep abrasions, angled as though the boat had scraped over rocks or been dragged across uneven ground. Yet there was no breach, no sign the vessel had filled with water. That contradiction puzzled everyone who studied it. Boats that sank usually bore wounds that explained their fate. This one looked as though it had been left to settle into the lake, intact but abandoned. Sheriff Harlan stood silently as the findings were catalogued, his face lined with the fatigue of a man who had lived with unanswered questions for too long. When reporters asked for a statement, he chose his words carefully. The recovery of this vessel provides new evidence, but it does not yet tell us the full story. We will continue to examine every detail until we understand what happened that day. Rachel sat outside in her car, her hands clenched around the steering wheel as though it anchored her to the present. Inside, her past was being dissected piece by piece, but the truth remained just out of reach. For years she had imagined waves, storms, accidents, and every nightmare in between. Now, faced with a boat that bore no fatal wound, she felt a different fear settle in. What if the water had never been the real enemy at all? The news of the boat's recovery spread quickly, drawing not just locals but people from neighboring towns who remembered the day Luke and his baby son had vanished. Cars lined the narrow road leading to Stillwater Lake, and families stood along the exposed shoreline as though waiting for the water itself to explain what it had hidden for so long. For many, it felt less like a crime scene and more like the reopening of a wound everyone in the valley carried. Reporters filed their stories with somber headlines, some focusing on the human loss, others leaning into the unanswered questions that only grew sharper. How had the boat sunk without damage? Why was the car seat still buckled, yet no remains were found? Each article reignited theories that had long since gone quiet. Some spoke of sudden storms and freak accidents. Others whispered about debts Luke may have owed or grudges that could have turned violent. In a place as small as Stillwater, rumor had always lived close to the truth. Rachel avoided the crowds, choosing instead to visit the lake in the early mornings when the shoreline was empty. She would walk to the cove where the boat had been discovered, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp earth. She stared at the impression the vessel had left in the mud, the shallow hollow where it had rested like a tomb. She tried to picture Luke's last moments, Caleb secure in his seat, Luke's steady hands guiding the boat. No image held long before dissolving into the same gnawing question: where had they gone? Sheriff Harlan ordered sonar scans of the deepest pockets of water that still remained. Divers marked new grids, their bodies breaking the surface again and again, faces weary with effort. Each search ended the same, with nothing more than weeds and silt clinging to their gear. The absence grew louder with every failed attempt. The town held a vigil on the courthouse lawn, candles flickering in glass jars, photographs of Luke and Caleb displayed on a wooden table draped with a quilt. Rachel stood quietly in the back, her face illuminated by the glow of dozens of flames. As voices rose in prayer, she felt the familiar ache of hope and fear twisting together. The boat had come back, but the two she loved most were still missing, as though the lake had chosen to return only part of the story. Investigators turned their attention to the objects that had been pulled from the boat, treating them with the same care as relics from an archaeological site. The baby's car seat, though warped and brittle, was placed on a steel table in the state crime lab. Technicians photographed the frayed straps and the way the buckle still latched firmly in place, a haunting detail that suggested Caleb had been secured on that final morning. The yellow blanket was swabbed for DNA and fibers, though time and water had stripped away much of what once clung to it. For Rachel, the testing felt unnecessary. She had no doubt it was the same blanket she had wrapped around her baby before Luke left. Attention soon shifted back to the boat itself. The scratches on the hull were more closely examined, their angles traced as though they could tell a story. Some experts suggested the vessel may have been dragged across rocks by the weight of waves after being abandoned, while others believed the markings were deliberate, as if someone had forced the boat into the lake rather than it drifting on its own. Neither theory answered the most important question: why had no remains been found? Sheriff Harlan reopened the case officially, calling it both a recovery and an investigation. Files that had gathered dust for 15 years were laid out on desks, and names long forgotten were spoken again. Deputies tracked down people who had been at the lake that day in 2004, asking them to repeat their stories. Most remembered only the confusion and the panic, but a few recalled details that now seemed more important. One man claimed he had seen Luke's truck parked at the launch longer than expected, the boat already gone from the trailer. Another mentioned hearing raised voices near the dock, though at the time he assumed it was nothing more than an argument between fishermen. Rachel listened to the new theories in silence, her face unreadable. For years she had begged for even a fragment of evidence, and now that it was here, it only deepened the uncertainty. The boat had survived almost intact, but her family had not. She found herself asking a question she had avoided for 15 years. What if Luke and Caleb had never drowned at all? What if something else had happened on that lake? Something the water had hidden until now? The reopening of the Branson case brought Stillwater back under a kind of spotlight it had not felt in years. Patrol cars circled the shrinking lake daily, and deputies stood watch as search teams combed through mudflats that had been hidden for decades. The lakebed looked more like a battlefield than a place of recreation, its cracked earth broken by patches of stagnant water and the skeletal outlines of driftwood. In that bleak setting, every scrap uncovered was treated as potential evidence, though most proved to be nothing more than bottles, cans, or rusted tools. Rachel returned one evening after the searchers had gone home, her footsteps sinking into the soft mud where the shoreline used to be. She stopped at the cove where the boat had been pulled, staring at the hollow it left behind, like a scar in the earth. The silence pressed around her, broken only by the distant call of a hawk. She tried to picture Luke lifting Caleb from the car seat, his steady arms cradling their son against the weight of the world. She could almost hear his laugh, the same one that had echoed in their kitchen when Caleb first learned to clap his hands. But the images dissolved, replaced by the sharp emptiness of what had been left behind. Inside the sheriff's office, investigators pieced together timelines. They studied old weather reports, noting that the afternoon of July 18, 2004, had been calm until a sudden storm swept across the lake. Witnesses had described dark clouds and a sharp wind that rattled boats at their docks. Yet if a storm had been strong enough to capsize Luke's vessel, why had the boat been found intact 15 years later, with no sign of catastrophic damage? The contradiction gnawed at Sheriff Harlan as he traced his finger across the old case file. The ink faded from years of handling. Locals began to speak more freely about their doubts. In the diner, whispers floated from booth to booth, questions about whether Luke had truly drowned or if someone else had been involved. Some mentioned debts he had been struggling with, while others swore they had seen him arguing with a stranger near the marina days before he vanished. For the first time in years, people allowed themselves to wonder if the lake had not been the sole keeper of this mystery. For Rachel, that possibility was both terrifying and strangely comforting. If the water had not claimed them, perhaps there was still more to find. The yellow blanket was the first item returned from the state lab, sealed in a new evidence bag with a tag marked simply Branson. Technicians had confirmed what Rachel already knew in her bones. The fabric carried traces of Caleb's DNA, fragments preserved despite 15 years beneath the water and mud. It was a small victory in science but a devastating blow in spirit. For Rachel, it was proof her baby had been there in that boat, buckled into the seat his father had secured, proof that the memory she carried of that morning had not been warped by grief. Investigators pressed on with other pieces of evidence. The car seat was analyzed for stress fractures, but none were found. It had not been torn free in chaos. Instead, it had remained bolted and buckled, untouched, until the day the boat surfaced. The condition made experts question whether Caleb had been removed deliberately rather than lost to the lake. That possibility unsettled the entire investigative team, hinting at human interference rather than accident. Sheriff Harlan convened a meeting with his deputies, spreading the old case file across the table. Photographs from 2004 were set beside the newest images, the contrast stark. One deputy suggested perhaps Luke had managed to get Caleb out of the boat when trouble struck, but if so, where had they gone? No footprints had been found then, and no remains had appeared now. Another deputy voiced what none wanted to say aloud, that someone else could have been present, unseen by the original search. Rachel sat in on one of these briefings, her hands folded tightly in her lap as theories swirled. She listened without interruption, her face a mask that gave nothing away. Inside, her heart twisted at the thought that Caleb may have been taken from that boat, that his story had not ended in the lake at all. It was a fragile thread of hope, but also a nightmare. If he had survived, it meant someone had stolen him. Outside, the drought continued to strip the lake bare, each day drawing the shoreline farther back. Locals watched with unease, wondering what else might rise from the depths. For Rachel, the shrinking water was no longer a symbol of nature's cruelty, but of possibility. The lake had returned the boat. Perhaps it had not yet finished speaking. Deputies continued their search along the muddy edges of the cove, their boots sinking with every step as they dragged poles through the sludge. It was tedious work, the kind that tested patience, but none of them dared rush. Every inch of ground seemed capable of giving up something tied to that missing summer of 2004. By mid-afternoon, one deputy called out, his pole catching on something solid just beneath the muck. The others hurried over, and together they pulled free a length of metal. It was heavily corroded, but beneath the rust, the shape of an old tackle box emerged. When it was opened back at the sheriff's garage, the interior was lined with mud, yet tucked inside were lures still faintly colored, hooks dulled with age, and one small carving knife. The initials L.B. were scratched clumsily into its wooden handle. Rachel identified it immediately. Luke had bought that knife as a teenager, keeping it with his fishing gear ever since. To her, it was more than an object, it was his presence, reaching across the years, proof that he had once stood on that boat with his son. But alongside the comfort came unease. Investigators noted how the tackle box had been found several yards from the boat, not within it. If the vessel had simply sunk, the box should have gone down with it. Its placement suggested it had been removed, either by current or by human hands. Sheriff Harlan ordered the surrounding area searched again, widening the perimeter to account for anything else that might have shifted from the wreck. Theories multiplied. Perhaps Luke had tried to wade ashore, carrying the box before being pulled under. Perhaps someone else had found it years earlier and dropped it back into the mud when rumors of the Branson case grew too loud. Each explanation opened as many questions as it answered. Rachel held the knife carefully when it was shown to her, her thumb tracing the worn initials. For a brief moment, she imagined Luke's hand wrapped around it, Caleb's small fingers tugging at his sleeve. Then the vision dissolved into the reality of the corroded metal and the years of silence. The lake was giving back fragments, but not the one truth she longed for. Somewhere between the tackle box and the boat lay the missing piece of what had truly happened that day. The discovery of the tackle box reignited the town's unease, stirring old conversations that had never really died. In the diner, people leaned over their coffee cups, speculating about what it meant that the box had been found apart from the boat. Some believed it proved Luke had tried to make it to shore with Caleb, only to be dragged under by the unpredictable currents of the lake. Others whispered darker possibilities, that maybe someone had been waiting on the bank that day, someone who had taken the boy while Luke struggled in the water. Sheriff Harlan listened to every theory with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that rumors sometimes carried truth. He walked the shoreline himself at dusk, studying the way the mud cracked under the heat and the water pulled back farther each evening. He remembered the first frantic days of the search, how convinced everyone had been that the boat and its passengers had sunk together. Now, standing over the hollow where the vessel had rested, he wondered if they had all been wrong. Rachel avoided the town chatter, but she could not escape it completely. At the grocery store, someone touched her arm gently and murmured, "Maybe this means Caleb got out." At church, a woman pressed her hand and said, "If the baby survived, he'd be 16 now." Those words left Rachel breathless. She had imagined her son at every age, built entire lives for him in her mind. Yet to hear someone else speak it aloud was both comforting and cruel. At the sheriff's office, evidence from the boat continued to be examined. Forensic experts noted faint impressions on the wood near the stern, patterns that looked suspiciously like shoe prints. Though degraded, they appeared smaller than an adult's, as if someone else had stood inside that boat at some point. The marks could have been left by searchers years later, or they could have been from that original day. Nothing could be proven, but the possibility was enough to send a ripple through the investigation. As the sun fell behind the ridgeline, the lake lay quiet, its surface low and dark. The drought had stripped it bare, leaving it vulnerable, exposing secrets long thought buried. Yet with each answer it offered, a darker question followed, as if the water itself was reluctant to let go of the full truth. The summer heat pressed heavier with each passing week, baking the mud along the shoreline into a cracked mosaic. Searchers moved slower now, weary but unwilling to abandon the ground that continued to yield fragments of the past. It was on one of those long afternoons that a deputy knelt near a shallow pool, his gloved hands brushing aside reeds until something pale caught the light. He lifted it carefully, and the sight silenced the group around him. It was a small shoe, stiffened by time and stained dark by the lakebed. Back at the sheriff's office, the shoe was laid on white paper beneath bright lamps. The leather had cracked, the laces fused together, but the outline was unmistakable. Rachel was called in, her stomach tightening the moment she stepped into the room. When the bagged shoe was placed before her, she pressed her hand to her mouth. She remembered tying those laces herself the morning Luke had carried Caleb out to the truck, the tiny blue sneakers she had bought because they made her baby look so proud, so steady on his unsteady feet. She nodded silently, confirming what no lab test was needed to prove. The discovery renewed the urgency of the investigation. Deputies spread outward from the spot where the shoe had been found, dragging poles and rakes through the muck, searching for more. The silence among them was heavy, each man and woman aware that they were no longer simply hunting for clues, but brushing against the final traces of a child who had been missing for 15 years. For Rachel, the shoe was both a comfort and a torment. It was proof that Caleb had been there, that his life had not vanished into rumor or speculation, but had been real and tangible. Yet it also raised darker possibilities. If the boat had been intact, and the car seat still buckled, then how had his shoe ended up separated in the mud? Had Luke tried to carry him? Had someone else placed it there? The questions churned endlessly, refusing to settle. That evening, as Rachel sat alone on her porch, the shoe's image burned into her mind. She thought of the weight of it in the evidence bag, far too small, far too fragile, and she whispered into the night what she had whispered for years. "Where are you, my boy?" The small shoe was still on everyone's mind when the search resumed the next morning. Deputies marked the area carefully, laying out flags in a wide circle around the discovery site, and began combing every inch with renewed intensity. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and the sun beat down on their backs, but no one complained. They knew they were treading on ground that had not seen light in decades, and with each step they carried the weight of a family's unanswered grief. By mid-afternoon, one of the searchers found a cluster of bones tangled in the weeds along a shallow ridge. They were small and fragile, worn smooth by years of water. The search team froze, the quiet broken only by the cry of a bird overhead. Carefully, the bones were lifted, catalogued, and sealed. Word spread quickly, and Sheriff Harlan himself carried them back to the office. Rachel was told gently that remains had been found, though officials were cautious not to draw conclusions until testing was complete. She sat in the station's small waiting room, her hands gripping each other so tightly her knuckles whitened. For 15 years she had lived with the ache of absence, with the torment of not knowing. The idea that the lake might finally be giving her a piece of truth was almost too much to bear. The bones were sent to the state crime lab for analysis, and the sheriff's office fell into a tense quiet. Deputies went about their duties with heavy steps, the weight of the discovery sinking into each of them. In the diner that night, the news spread in hushed tones. Some whispered it must be Caleb, others said it could just as easily be an animal's remains, but all agreed on one thing: the lake was no longer silent. Rachel drove to the shoreline after dusk, the lakebed now cloaked in shadow. She stood at the spot where the shoe had been found and looked out across the receding water. The silence felt different now, charged with the sense that answers were closer than ever. She closed her eyes and whispered her son's name into the dark, knowing that within days the lab would tell her what her heart already feared. The results from the state lab arrived 3 days later, delivered in a sealed envelope that Sheriff Harlan opened with deliberate care. Inside were the findings that everyone in Stillwater had been waiting for. The bones pulled from the lakebed were confirmed to be human, but the analysis stopped short of declaring them Caleb's. They belonged to an adult male, their size and condition suggesting someone in his 20s or 30s. For the sheriff and his deputies, the conclusion was unavoidable. The remains were almost certainly those of Luke Branson. Rachel was called into the office and seated across from Harlan, who spoke with the careful tone of a man who had rehearsed the words too many times. She absorbed them quietly, her gaze fixed on a framed photograph on the wall behind him rather than on his face. Luke's fate, long feared but never proven, was now undeniable. He had not run away, had not staged some disappearance. He had died at the lake, and the water had hidden him for 15 long years. Yet the confirmation brought no peace. The shoe and the blanket had pointed to Caleb, but the bones did not. The child's fate remained untold. For Rachel, it was like having half a sentence spoken, the ending withheld. She walked out of the sheriff's office, into the blinding summer sun, the sounds of the small town bustling as usual, and felt the surreal weight of being the only one carrying two conflicting truths at once. Her husband was gone. Her son was still missing. The news rippled through Stillwater, quieting the gossip that had once painted Luke as a man who might have abandoned his family. Old friends who had doubted him now spoke with regret, admitting they had been wrong. In the diner, a man who had known Luke since childhood bowed his head and said, "He died out there trying to keep his boy safe." But even in sympathy, another question lingered. If Luke had perished, then what had become of Caleb? That night, Rachel stood on her porch with the evidence bag containing the tiny shoe on the table beside her. She whispered a promise into the cooling air, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "I know now what happened to your father," she said softly, "and I will not stop until I know what happened to you." The confirmation of Luke's remains shifted the investigation in a profound way. What had once been treated as a tragic accident was now approached as something far more complex. If Luke had drowned that day, why had his son not been found with him? The intact car seat suggested Caleb had been strapped in, but the separated shoe and absence of a child's body told another story entirely. The contradiction gnawed at Sheriff Harlan, keeping him awake at night as he pored over faded notes and grainy photographs from the original case. Deputies expanded their search farther along the dried shoreline, digging in spots where the mud was still soft and probing deeper channels that remained. Each day yielded debris, old fishing rods, rusted cans, fragments of rope, but nothing that explained Caleb's fate. Forensic divers combed the last dark pockets of water, their bubbles breaking the surface in rhythmic bursts, only to resurface with empty hands. The absence was louder now than it had ever been. Rachel moved through those days in a haze of conflicting emotions. She grieved for Luke, the finality of his death pressing against her chest, but she could not bring herself to plan a funeral. Not while Caleb's fate remained a question mark. At night she would sit at her kitchen table with the shoe laid before her, tracing the curve of its leather with trembling fingers. She tried to imagine how it had come off, whether it had slipped free as Luke carried him, or if it had been torn away by someone else's hand. The town itself seemed restless. In quiet conversations on porches and in pews, people admitted aloud what many had only thought in private, that perhaps Caleb had not drowned at all. The idea was both hopeful and horrifying. If he had survived, who had taken him and why? 16 years old now, he would be somewhere out in the world, his identity stolen before it could even take shape. Sheriff Harlan gave a short statement to the press, his voice grave. "We have recovered Mr. Branson's remains, but the search for Caleb continues. Until we know what happened to that boy, this case will remain open." His words settled heavily over the crowd, a reminder that the lake had not finished its story, and neither had the mystery that had haunted Stillwater for 15 long years. Rachel found herself drawn back to the sheriff's office day after day, needing to be close to the investigation, even if it meant sitting silently in a corner while deputies shuffled papers and radios crackled with half-formed leads. She studied the maps pinned across the walls, the red circles marking search areas, the lines tracing where the water had once been. Every detail mattered to her, because she had learned that grief sharpens into obsession when there are no answers. One afternoon, Detective Sarah Klein from the State Bureau arrived, carrying with her a fresh perspective unclouded by the small-town familiarity that had shaped the case for years. She laid out photographs of the recovered boat and pointed to the scratches along the hull. "These weren't caused by waves or rocks," she said firmly. "This looks deliberate, like the boat was forced along the shoreline before being left to sink." Her words tightened the room into silence. If she was right, then Luke and Caleb had not been victims of an accident. Someone had put them in that position. The theory revived memories from 2004 that many had tucked away. A deputy recalled how a fisherman had reported shouting near the dock that morning, though it had never been corroborated. Another remembered a truck seen idling near the launch long after Luke's had already gone. These details had seemed irrelevant when everyone believed the lake had swallowed father and son. Now they took on a different weight. Rachel listened, her pulse quickening with each revelation. She remembered Luke mentioning a disagreement with a man at the marina days before they vanished, though he had brushed it off at the time. She had not thought of it in years, but now the memory returned with sharp clarity. Had that argument been more than a fleeting clash? Detective Klein requested all original witness statements, determined to track down anyone who had been near the lake that morning. For Rachel, the idea that someone else had been present, someone who may have seen her son's fate, was both terrifying and galvanizing. If Caleb had not drowned, then he might have been taken, and that meant there was still a thread, faint, fragile, but real, that could lead to him. That night, Rachel stood by the window, staring at the shrinking outline of the lake. For the first time in years, she whispered not only her son's name, but a promise: "I'm coming for you." Detective Klein worked with the precision of someone who refused to accept loose ends. She spread the old files across the conference table, cross-referencing faded notes with the photographs taken in 2019. Her focus landed on a detail many had overlooked. In the original reports, a witness had described a second vehicle parked near the launch that morning, a dark pickup with no plates visible. At the time, investigators assumed it belonged to another fisherman and moved on. Now, paired with the discovery of the boat's deliberate scarring, the detail looked like a lead that had been buried too quickly. She and Sheriff Harlan began the painstaking task of contacting everyone who had been at the lake that day. Some had moved away, others had passed on, but a few still remembered fragments of that morning. An elderly woman recalled seeing a man she did not recognize leaning against a truck near the dock, smoking a cigarette and watching the water. She had dismissed him then, but the memory had lingered, sharp in its strangeness. Rachel listened intently as each new piece surfaced, her heart caught between dread and fragile hope. The thought that someone had been there, watching Luke and Caleb, was unbearable, yet it also meant there was an explanation beyond the cruel silence of the lake. It meant her son's story might not have ended in the water. Searchers continued to comb the exposed shoreline, but the focus had shifted from what the lake could reveal to what the town itself might still be hiding. Records from 2004 showed that Luke had argued with a man over a property dispute weeks before he vanished. The man's name surfaced again in whispers among townsfolk, his reputation marked by temper and grudges. Detective Klein requested to re-interview him, determined to fill the gaps left 15 years ago. Rachel walked past the Branson mailbox that evening, her hand brushing the rusted metal as though expecting to find a letter waiting inside, a message from the son who should have been 16 now. She closed her eyes and imagined his face, the way it might have changed, the sound of his voice grown older. The boat had returned, and Luke had been found, but Caleb remained the unanswered question. In her heart, Rachel clung to a possibility stronger than grief. If someone had taken him, then perhaps he was still out there, waiting for her to find him. Detective Klein's attention soon turned to a name buried deep in the original witness list, one that had been dismissed at the time as unimportant. A groundskeeper from a private marina, half a mile from the public launch, had reported seeing a man carrying something bulky wrapped in a blanket toward a truck on the morning of July 18, 2004. The description had been vague, the statement brief, and with no missing persons identified at that moment, it had slipped quietly into the margins of the case. Now, 15 years later, it felt chillingly relevant. Sheriff Harlan admitted the report had always nagged at him, but without evidence he had been forced to move on. Klein pressed him to revisit it, convinced it could explain why the boat had been abandoned while Luke's body and Caleb's fate had remained hidden. The pair drove out to the marina, which was now little more than a rotting dock and a boarded-up office. Standing on the weathered planks, Klein studied the sightlines. From here, one could easily watch the lake traffic and the public launch without being noticed. It was the perfect vantage point for someone waiting. Rachel joined them later, her hands trembling as she ran them over the cracked wood rails. She remembered Luke mentioning that someone had been watching him days before he vanished, though he had laughed it off as nothing more than paranoia. Now, the memory carried a different weight. She could almost see the shadow of a man standing there, waiting for her husband to push off into the water. Deputies began looking for the old groundskeeper, combing through records to see if he was still alive and willing to speak again. Klein was relentless, convinced the vague memory of a man with a blanket might in fact have been the site of Caleb being carried away. If true, it would mean Luke had died at the lake, but his son had been taken before the boat sank. That night Rachel lay awake, her mind torn between the agony of loss and the fragile thread of hope. If Caleb had been taken, he could still be alive somewhere. 16 years had passed, but the thought of him breathing under the same sky filled her with a determination she had not felt in years. She whispered into the darkness, "Hold on, Caleb. I'm still looking." The groundskeeper was found living in a small trailer on the outskirts of Billings, his health failing, but his memory surprisingly sharp. When Detective Klein and Sheriff Harlan arrived, he greeted them with the caution of a man who had carried a secret too long. They laid out the old report, and after a long pause, he admitted he remembered more than he had originally said. On the morning of July 18, 2004, he had seen a man walking quickly from the dock toward a dark pickup, carrying something cradled close to his chest. At first he thought it was fishing gear, but when the blanket slipped, he caught sight of what looked like a child's arm. He had told the deputies back then, but when no child was reported missing at the marina, they had brushed him off. "I didn't push it," he confessed now, his voice heavy, "but I've thought about it every day since." The revelation shook the investigation to its core. It aligned with the evidence they had now, the intact car seat, the missing remains of Caleb, and the boat that bore signs of being abandoned, not destroyed. If the groundskeeper's words were true, then Caleb had been carried off the lake alive. The image haunted Rachel, filling her with both anguish and a fierce hope. For 15 years she had imagined the water dragging her son away. Now she could imagine arms instead, someone lifting him from that boat, taking him to a life she could neither see nor touch. Detective Klein pressed the old man for details. He remembered the pickup as dark green, maybe black, with its plates obscured by mud. The man carrying the child was broad-shouldered, wearing a cap pulled low. He had not recognized him, but he remembered the speed, the urgency with which he moved, like he didn't want anyone to see, the groundskeeper said softly. Back in Stillwater, the revelation spread quickly, fueling whispers that had simmered for years. Rachel sat in her kitchen with the evidence bag containing Caleb's shoe before her, her heart pounding. If her son had been taken, then somewhere in the world a 16-year-old boy bore his face, his blood, his name. The truth was shifting, and for the first time since 2004, she dared to believe the story was not only about what the lake had taken, but also about what it might have hidden all along. Detective Klein moved quickly after the groundskeeper's revelation, combing through old vehicle records to track dark pickups registered in the county during 2004. The task was monumental, but with each search she narrowed the list. Sheriff Harlan, though cautious, admitted that the lead made more sense than any explanation they had chased before. The image of a man carrying Caleb away from the marina explained why the boat was left intact and why Luke's body had remained while his son vanished without a trace. It was not the lake that had stolen Caleb, but human hands. Rachel sat in on the meetings, her presence a steady reminder of why the work mattered. She studied each name as though sheer focus might make one leap from the page. When Klein pointed out a man named Warren Pike, Rachel felt her stomach twist. Pike had been a contractor who lived 2 towns over in 2004, known for his temper and his disputes with Luke over a property line that bordered family land. Rachel remembered Luke brushing off Pike's threats as bluster, but she had never forgotten the edge in his voice when he said the man wasn't right. Detectives pulled Pike's old file, uncovering a string of charges ranging from theft to assault, though none had ever stuck long enough to put him behind bars. More disturbing was the record of him owning a dark green pickup registered during the exact window of time the groundskeeper described. Pike had since sold it, but the detail was enough to ignite suspicion. Klein ordered surveillance on Pike, who still lived in Montana, working odd jobs under the radar. Deputies reported he was solitary, reclusive, and avoided eye contact with neighbors. When asked about 2004, he grew defensive, claiming he knew nothing about the Branson case and that he had never even been near Stillwater Lake. The denial only deepened the unease. Rachel drove past Pike's property one evening, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she slowed. She saw him sitting on his porch, older now but unmistakable, his eyes sharp even from a distance. For the first time in years, she felt her grief turn into something else, a raw, simmering anger. If he had taken her son, then Caleb was out there somewhere, living a life stolen from her. The drought had pulled a boat from the lake, but it had also dragged long-buried truths into the light, and Rachel was ready to face them. Detective Klein and Sheriff Harlan secured a warrant to search Warren Pike's property, the culmination of weeks spent threading together evidence that pointed in his direction. Deputies moved in at dawn, their boots crunching across the gravel driveway as Pike watched from his porch, his face lined with irritation but not surprise. He muttered under his breath as the papers were read, insisting once again that he had nothing to do with the Branson disappearance. Yet as the team spread out across the sagging house and the sheds that leaned against the tree line, it was clear Pike was nervous. His hands fidgeted, his eyes darting to the back fields as though something there might betray him. Inside the shed closest to the woods, investigators found boxes stacked high with old tools, broken lanterns, and rusted fishing gear. Buried beneath them was a trunk sealed tight with a padlock. When it was pried open, the contents silenced the room. Inside were children's belongings, neatly folded shirts, toys dulled by time, and a small blanket patterned with faded stars. Though worn, Rachel recognized it instantly. It was one she had sewn herself when Caleb was born. The air in the shed grew heavy, as if the past itself had been exhumed. Detective Klein held up the blanket, her jaw tight. "This is enough to tie him to that day," she said, her voice steady. Pike shouted from the porch, denying it all, claiming the trunk had been left by someone else years ago. But his words fell flat against the weight of the evidence. Deputies cataloged each item, their faces grim as they realized what they had uncovered. Rachel, who had been waiting with Harlan at the edge of the property, was shown the photographs later. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears slipping down her face as she confirmed what no one else could: the belongings had been Caleb's. That confirmation turned suspicion into something undeniable. Pike had not only been near the lake that day, but he had carried her son away and kept fragments of his life hidden in that trunk. The discovery shook Stillwater. Whispers filled the town that evening, carrying both horror and a strange glimmer of hope. If Pike had kept Caleb's belongings, then perhaps he had kept the boy himself, at least for a time. And if that were true, then somewhere beyond those woods and years, her son might still be alive. The arrest of Warren Pike came swiftly after the discovery of the trunk, deputies leading him in handcuffs past the sagging porch where he had spent years hiding in plain sight. His denials grew louder as the cameras closed in, but the blanket and toys spoke louder than he ever could. The town watched in stunned silence as the man long whispered about was finally exposed as more than just a bitter recluse. For Rachel, seeing him taken away did not bring relief. It brought a hollow ache, because the one truth she needed was still missing. Where was Caleb? Detective Klein pressed Pike during questioning, her voice steady as she laid the evidence before him. He refused to admit to taking the boy, claiming the items in the trunk had been stolen from another house years earlier, but cracks began to show in his story. He had been near Stillwater Lake on the day Luke and Caleb vanished, and he had owned a truck matching the description the groundskeeper had given. The timeline fit too neatly to be coincidence. As the investigation widened, Klein began working with federal authorities, believing Pike might not have acted alone. Records hinted at his connections to others with criminal histories, men who drifted between odd jobs and remote towns. The possibility that Caleb had been passed on, raised under another name, became more than speculation. It was a path that could still be followed, though the trail was old. Rachel sat in her kitchen that night with the small blue shoe in front of her, the evidence bag crinkling beneath her fingertips. The candle she had lit beside it flickered in the dark, casting shadows across the walls that seemed to move with her grief. Luke's remains had been found, his death confirmed. But Caleb remained both gone and not gone, existing in that unbearable space between hope and despair. She whispered his name into the quiet, not as a farewell, but as a promise. The drought had revealed the boat, the blanket, and the truth about Luke. It had dragged Warren Pike's secrets into the light, yet it had left the greatest question unanswered. And as Rachel stared out at the darkened horizon, she understood her search was not over. The lake had given her fragments, but somewhere beyond Stillwater, her son's story still waited to be told.